Dad told me not to come to his funeral, because his real family would be there. I sent flowers with the note. From your real mistake. The first sound I remember after giving birth to my son was not his cry, but the sterile, confident click of expensive heels on linoleum. I was floating in that strange sea between exhaustion and euphoria, a place where pain and joy were indistinguishable. My body was a battlefield that had just found peace, and my son, Leo, was the prize, sleeping soundly in a plastic bassinet beside my bed. The room was dim, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and baby powder. My husband, David, should have been there, holding my hand, his face a mess of happy tears. But David was gone. He'd been gone for 8 months, the victim of a sudden, inexplicable heart arrhythmia that had stolen him from us just weeks after we'd learned about Leo. His absence was a raw, physical ache that even the miracle of childbirth couldn't numb. So when the heels clicked to a stop beside my bed, I assumed it was a nurse. I tried to pry my heavy eyelids open. It was Margaret, my mother-in-law. She stood there, not in the soft, grandmotherly pastels I might have expected, but in a charcoal gray power suit, her silver hair styled into a helmet of perfection. She looked like she was about to close a hostile takeover, not meet her first and only grandchild. Beside her stood a man in a rumpled suit holding a briefcase, and a woman with a tired, professionally sympathetic face. The joy in the room curdled. The air grew thin and cold. Margaret's smile was a thin, bloodless line. It didn't reach her eyes, which were scanning the room, assessing, calculating. They were the same pale blue eyes as David's, but where his had been warm and full of life, hers were chips of ice. "Clara," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge of something sharp and final. "Congratulations. You've had the heir." It wasn't a greeting, it was a statement of fact, a confirmation of a transaction. I tried to push myself up, a protest forming in my throat, but the effort was monumental. My limbs felt like lead. The epidural was wearing off, but a profound weariness had settled deep in my bones. I was vulnerable, exposed, and she knew it. She thrived on it. "Margaret, what is this? Who are these people?" I managed, my voice a dry rasp. My Uncle Robert, my mom's brother, and my only real family since her passing, had been in the room just moments before. He'd stepped into the ensuite bathroom to take a call, promising to be right back. I glanced at the closed door, praying he'd hurry. "This is Mr. Abernathy, my legal counsel," she said, gesturing to the man with the briefcase. "And this is Janice from Child Protective Services." The words hit me like a physical blow. Child Protective Services. The name itself was a weapon, and it was aimed directly at my heart, at the tiny, sleeping baby beside me. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the post-delivery fog. "We need to have a serious conversation about Leo's welfare." I stared at her, my mind struggling to connect the dots. Leo's welfare? He was less than 4 hours old. He was perfect. He was safe. What could she possibly mean? The man, Abernathy, opened his briefcase with a series of loud, officious clicks. He pulled out a sheaf of papers and placed them on my bedside table, next to a half-empty cup of water. "This," he said, his voice a droning monotone, "is an emergency petition for temporary custody of the minor child, Leo Prescott. It alleges maternal unfitness due to a documented history of substance abuse and current signs of relapse." Relapse. The word was a branding iron, searing into me, bringing with it all the shame and fear I had fought so hard to leave behind. It was true. I had a history. Years ago, a bad car accident had led to a nasty, desperate addiction to prescription painkillers. It was the darkest period of my life, a blur of lies and self-destruction that had nearly cost me everything. But I had clawed my way back. I had been sober for 5 years. 5 clean, hard-won years. I had sponsors. I went to meetings. I did the work every single day. David had known. He had been my biggest supporter, my rock. He knew I would never, ever, jeopardize our child. "That's a lie," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I'm not using. I'm clean." "You know I am," my eyes pleaded with Margaret. This had to be some kind of grotesque misunderstanding, a twisted expression of her grief over David. She had always been controlling, always viewed me with a thinly veiled suspicion, as if I were a gold digger who had trapped her perfect son. But this was a new level of cruelty. This was monstrous. Margaret let out a small, theatrical sigh. She stepped closer, and for a moment, I thought she might touch me, offer some sliver of comfort. Instead, she looked down at me with an expression of profound pity, the kind a scientist might reserve for a failed experiment. She believed I was sedated, confused, a wreck. She thought the standard post-C-section opioid drip was clouding my mind. She was wrong. I had made it clear to my doctors, in a plan signed and witnessed months ago, that I was to receive no narcotic painkillers. My post-operative medication was a powerful, non-narcotic anti-inflammatory. I was tired, I was in pain, but I was lucid. And she had no idea that my uncle, a man who had spent 30 years as a homicide detective, was 10 feet away, behind a thin bathroom door. "Oh, Clara," she purred, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She waved a dismissive hand at her lawyer and the social worker, as if they were merely stagehands in her grand production. "Let's not pretend. We both know what you are. David, bless his heart, he was blinded by you. He wanted to believe you could change. But I always knew. I knew the weakness was still in you, festering." She thought she was speaking to an incoherent patient. She thought she was delivering a final, triumphant monologue before the curtain fell. She was, in fact, confessing. "I've been documenting everything for months," she continued, her voice filled with a chilling, gloating pride. "Every time you seemed a little tired, a little off, I had my housekeeper keep an eye on you. I told everyone how worried I was, how you were struggling with the pregnancy and David's death. It was the perfect narrative, a grieving, unstable addict, succumbing to her demons. It's so tragically believable, isn't it?" She smiled, a genuine, horrifying smile of pure victory. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a sudden act of panic. This was a plan. A long, carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy me and take my son. Why? I choked out, the single word a testament to my disbelief. "He's my son. He's David's son. He is a Prescott," she corrected me sharply. "He is the heir to everything my husband built. Everything David was supposed to protect. I will not let that legacy be managed by a junkie. I will not let Prescott money be squandered on your habits." She leaned in closer, her perfume cloying and suffocating. I tried to warn David. He wouldn't listen. He was so stubborn. Always choosing you. Even his health. He ignored my concerns. He was under so much stress, trying to manage you. The insinuation was vile, twisting David's death into another tool to use against me. My shock was so profound it felt like a physical paralysis. Every strange comment, every backhanded compliment, every concerned call to our friends over the past year suddenly clicked into place. She hadn't been offering support. She had been laying a foundation of doubt, poisoning the well, painting me as a fragile, ticking time bomb. She believed she had won. She stood there, smug and victorious, having laid out her entire strategy, her entire motive, believing her audience was too incapacitated to comprehend the depth of her betrayal. And then, the bathroom door opened. Uncle Robert stepped out, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He wasn't a large man, but he filled the doorway with an aura of authority that decades in law enforcement had forged into his very bones. He held his phone in his hand, its screen glowing. He had not been on a call. He had been recording. The smug smile on Margaret's face didn't just falter, it shattered. Her face went slack, her skin turning a pasty, blotchy white. The lawyer, Abernathy, looked up from his papers, his professional composure vanishing, replaced by the panicked look of a man who suddenly realized he was accessory to something far uglier than a simple custody dispute. "Margaret Prescott," Uncle Robert said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "I think you, your lawyer, and this woman, need to leave. Now." He took a step forward, his eyes locked on hers. "And for the record, every single word you just said has been recorded. Every single word." The social worker Janice was the first to react. She looked from my uncle's face to Margaret's crumbling facade, then down at me, lying in the hospital bed, tears now streaming silently down my face. A flicker of understanding, of horror, crossed her features. She took a half step back, distancing herself from the toxicity radiating from my mother-in-law. Abernathy began frantically, uselessly, shuffling his papers back into his briefcase. But Margaret, for a moment, just stood there, frozen. The mask was gone. In its place was pure, unadulterated hatred, aimed directly at me. It was the face of a cornered animal. Then, Without another word, she turned and swept out of the room, the click of her heels no longer confident, but frantic, escaping. Her accomplices scurried after her like rats fleeing a burning ship. The silence they left behind was vast and echoing. Uncle Robert was at my side in an instant, his large, warm hand covering mine. "It's okay, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've got you. We've got her." But I couldn't speak. The shock had given way to a tidal wave of grief and rage so immense it threatened to drown me. My body began to shake, deep, racking sobs tearing through me. I wasn't just weeping for the betrayal, for the monstrousness of her actions. I was weeping for David, for the family I thought I had married into, for the illusion that had just been so violently ripped away. My baby, my sweet Leo, startled by the noise, began to cry. His tiny, helpless wail was the only thing that anchored me to the present, the only thing that kept me from floating away into the darkness. He needed me, and I was going to fight for him. The war had just begun. The hours that followed were a blur of hospital staff, security, and the arrival of a patient advocate. Uncle Robert had insisted on calling. The advocate, a woman named Maria, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, immediately put a block on all visitors except for my uncle and my sponsor, Sarah, who arrived looking like she was ready for battle. Maria reviewed the hospital's records, confirming my medication protocol and adding her own notes about the incident. She spoke in a calm, procedural tone that was immensely grounding. She was turning Margaret's ambush into a documented event, a piece of evidence. The system that Margaret had tried to weaponize against me was now, slowly, beginning to turn in my favor. When Sarah arrived, she simply wrapped me in a hug and let me cry. She didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She had been with me through the darkest days of my recovery, and she knew that sometimes the only thing to do was to feel the full weight of the pain. "We'll take this one day at a time, Clara," she murmured into my hair. "Just like always, you're not alone in this." Her presence was a shield. With her on one side and my uncle on the other, I felt the first flicker of strength return. Uncle Robert, meanwhile, had shifted into full detective mode. He was on the phone, his voice low and serious. He was calling a lawyer he knew, one of the best family law attorneys in the state, a woman named Anya Sharma. "She's a shark, Clara," he told me after he hung up. "And we've just given her blood in the water." He replayed the recording from his phone, and hearing Margaret's voice, so full of venom and self-assurance, was sickening. But it was also empowering. It was the truth. It was undeniable. The next morning, Anya Sharma arrived. She was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried an aura of intimidating intelligence. She listened to the recording without a single change in her expression, her focus absolute. When it was finished, she looked at me, her gaze direct and assessing. "They will say you were groggy," she stated. "They will say your uncle has a vendetta. They will say this recording was taken out of context. They will try to bury us in motions and character assassinations. Are you ready for that?" I looked over at Leo, sleeping peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling. He was so new, so innocent. And his grandmother had tried to steal him from me before I'd even had a chance to be his mother. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "I'm ready." Anya nodded, a small, satisfied smile touching her lips. "Good," she said. "Then let's begin." And so began the methodical, grueling process of building my case. The first step was a preemptive strike. Anya filed for an emergency restraining order against Margaret, using the recording and a sworn affidavit from my uncle as primary evidence. A judge granted it immediately, barring Margaret from coming within 500 feet of me or Leo. It was a small victory, but it felt like reclaiming a piece of my own territory. It meant I could leave the hospital without fear of another ambush. My uncle turned my small guest room into a makeshift command center. He set up a whiteboard and began drawing out a timeline, a web of connections, a list of potential witnesses. "She said she's been planning this for months," he said, tapping the board with a pen. "That means there's a trail. People she talked to, things she did. We just have to find it." We started by documenting everything. I spent hours writing down every conversation, every interaction with Margaret since David's death, every subtle dig, every overly concerned phone call, every time she offered me a cup of calming tea that left me feeling groggy and unwell. At the time, I had dismissed it as her awkward way of grieving, of trying to care for me. Now, I saw it through a new, terrifying lens. Anya's team subpoenaed Margaret's phone records, her emails, her financial statements. They requested depositions from the housekeeper she had mentioned, from family, friends, from anyone Margaret had tried to poison against me. The process was slow, a meticulous assembly of 1,000 tiny pieces. Each piece was a confirmation of her gaslighting, a testament to the fact that I wasn't crazy. I had been systematically undermined by the one person who should have been a source of support in my grief. The pushback from Margaret's legal team was immediate and brutal. They filed motions to have the recording thrown out, claiming it was an illegal wiretap. They filed a countersuit for defamation. They painted me in court documents as a manipulative, unstable addict who had tricked their beloved son and was now trying to extort the family. They dredged up every mistake from my past, twisting my recovery into a fragile, temporary state, suggesting my grief was the perfect trigger for a relapse. Reading those filings felt like being flayed alive. They were using my deepest vulnerabilities, the very things I had worked so hard to heal, as weapons. There were days I wanted to give up. The stress was immense, a constant weight on my chest. I was trying to bond with my newborn son, to navigate the sleepless nights and overwhelming love of new motherhood, all while fighting a legal war against a woman with limitless resources and no conscience. I would sit up late at night, holding Leo, and just weep, terrified that she would somehow win, that she would take him from me. In those moments, I would call Sarah, my sponsor. She would talk me down, remind me to breathe, to focus on the next right thing. Sometimes the next right thing was just changing a diaper. Sometimes it was making a cup of tea. Sometimes it was just surviving the next 5 minutes without screaming. My support network became my lifeline. Uncle Robert was my strategist, Anya my general, and Sarah my medic. They held the line for me when I felt like crumbling. My uncle's old contacts in the police force provided quiet advice. One of them, a detective named Garcia, took a particular interest in the case off the record. He found the casual mention of David's health in Margaret's monologue particularly disturbing. "It's a long shot," he told my uncle over the phone one night, a call I overheard from the living room. "But sudden arrhythmias in healthy 30-year-olds are rare. It might be worth looking at his medical records again, seeing if anything was missed." Then came the financial coercion. Margaret, through her lawyers, offered a settlement. It was a staggering amount of money, millions of dollars, enough to set me and Leo up for life, anywhere in the world. But it came with conditions. I would have to drop all legal action, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and agree to a joint custody arrangement where Margaret would be the primary caregiver for the first 5 years of Leo's life. It was a bribe wrapped in a threat. It was her attempt to buy my son. Anya advised me to reject it immediately. "This isn't about money, Clara," she said, her voice firm. "This is about your safety and your son's. A woman like that will never honor an agreement. She wants control, not a truce." I told her to send back a one-word reply. No. The rejection of her offer unleashed a new wave of attacks. She began to mobilize the family. David's aunts, uncles, and cousins, people who had been kind to me at our wedding, suddenly stopped returning my calls. I started seeing passive-aggressive posts on social media, vague statements about protecting David's legacy and praying for those who are lost. She had fed them her narrative, and they had swallowed it whole. I was isolated, cast as the villain in my own story. The betrayal from the wider family hurt in a different way, a dull, spreading ache of loneliness. They were choosing her money and her lies over David's wife and child. One of the most difficult parts of the investigation was the deposition of Margaret's housekeeper, a woman named Rosa. Rosa was terrified. She had worked for Margaret for 20 years and was dependent on her for her livelihood. Anya had to fight to get her to speak, assuring her of legal protections. In the deposition, Rosa admitted, haltingly, that Margaret had instructed her to report on my every move. She had been told to look for signs of drinking or drug use. But then, under Anya's careful questioning, she revealed something more. She spoke of the special herbal teas Margaret would insist on preparing for me herself whenever I visited. She said they were for calming the nerves, Rosa said, her voice barely a whisper. But sometimes, after Senora Clara would leave, I would find a small empty blister pack in the kitchen trash, the kind for sleeping pills. It was a bombshell. A small, terrifying piece of the puzzle that suggested something far more sinister than just psychological manipulation. Anya immediately filed a motion to have my prenatal vitamin bottles, which I had kept, tested by a forensic lab. I had switched brands halfway through my pregnancy because I'd been feeling so perpetually drowsy and foggy. My doctor had assured me it was a normal pregnancy symptom, but now, a horrifying suspicion began to form. What if it wasn't? What if she had been drugging me? The lab results came back 2 weeks later. It was our evidentiary turning point. The forensic toxicologist's report was chillingly clear. Several capsules in the old bottle had been expertly opened, their contents partially replaced with a fine powder. The powder was identified as a potent benzodiazepine, a sedative. The dosage was small, not enough to cause serious harm to the fetus, but more than enough to cause the exact symptoms I had been experiencing: drowsiness, confusion, memory fog. It was designed to make me appear unstable, to create the very evidence she needed to support her claims of my relapse. It was calculated, premeditated, and utterly evil. Anya took the report to the district attorney's office. What had started as a custody battle was now a criminal investigation. The charges were elevated to assault, reckless endangerment, and administering a noxious substance. The news sent a shockwave through the case. Margaret's legal team immediately went on the defensive, claiming the evidence was fabricated, that I had tampered with the vitamins myself to frame her. But the science was irrefutable. The lab had even identified trace amounts of Margaret's DNA on the tampered capsules. The revelation about the vitamins sent Detective Garcia, my uncle's friend, back to David's case file. He remembered something from the original coroner's report. Trace amounts of the same class of benzodiazepine had been found in David's system during the autopsy. At the time, it had been dismissed. David had no prescription, and the amount was so small it was deemed clinically insignificant, possibly a lab error or cross-contamination. But now, in this new context, it was no longer insignificant. It was a pattern. The district attorney, spurred by the new evidence in my case, made a decision that I both dreaded and knew was necessary. They petitioned for a court order to exhume David's body for further toxicological testing. The thought of disturbing his final resting place was agonizing. It felt like a violation, another trauma piled on top of so many others. I spent a long night sitting with Sarah, wrestling with the decision, before finally giving my consent. If Margaret had done something to him, if she had contributed to his death in any way, the world had to know. For David's sake, and for Leo's, I had to see it through. The exhumation and subsequent analysis took weeks. It was a period of agonizing suspense. During this time, my legal team and I had to make strategic decisions. The criminal case was now running parallel to the family court custody case. Anya argued that we should focus all our energy on the criminal charges, as a conviction there would make the custody issue a foregone conclusion. We decided to prioritize the assault charges related to the tampered vitamins, as that was where our evidence was strongest. The question of David's death was a shadow that loomed over everything, but proving murder would be infinitely more difficult. We had to choose the battle we were most likely to win. The media got wind of the story. A wealthy society widow accused of drugging her daughter-in-law and a potential link to her son's mysterious death. It was a story made for headlines. My name and face were everywhere. Reporters camped outside my house. The character assassination Margaret had started was now playing out on a public stage. I was portrayed as either a tragic victim or a scheming villain. I shut it all out. I turned off the television, stayed off the internet, and focused on Leo. His gurgles, his smiles, his tiny hands wrapped around my finger. He was my reality, my anchor in the storm. The new toxicology reports from David's remains came back. They confirmed the presence of the benzodiazepine at a level higher than originally detected. More damningly, they also found traces of a difficult-to-detect cardiac drug, one known to cause heart arrhythmias in certain doses, especially when combined with sedatives. It was not a smoking gun. It wasn't definitive proof of murder, but it was a deeply disturbing pattern of behavior. The DA decided there was enough to add a charge of manslaughter to Margaret's indictment, though they warned us it would be the hardest charge to prove. Finally, after months of legal wrangling, pretrial motions, and endless delays, the court date was set. The custody hearing and the criminal trial were to be consolidated, a complex legal proceeding that would decide both my son's future and my mother-in-law's freedom. I knew the hardest part was yet to come. I would have to get on the stand. I would have to face her, and her lawyers, and tell my story. I spent weeks with Anya, preparing for my testimony. We went over every detail, every possible question, every line of attack. She prepped me for the cross-examination, playing the role of Margaret's ruthless attorney. It was brutal, forcing me to relive the trauma again and again, but it was necessary. I had to be ready. I had to be unbreakable. The morning of the trial, I stood in front of my mirror, dressed in a simple, conservative navy blue dress Anya had approved. I looked at my reflection. I saw the exhaustion in my eyes, the faint lines of stress around my mouth. But I also saw something else, something that hadn't been there a year ago. A core of steel. I was not the same woman who had lain helpless in that hospital bed. I was a survivor. I was a mother. I picked up a small framed photo of David from my dresser. His smile was bright, his eyes full of love. "For you?" I whispered. "And for Leo." Then I went to face my monster. The courtroom was a blur of polished wood and muted colors, cold and impersonal. Margaret sat at the defendant's table, flanked by a team of expensive-looking lawyers. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished without her power suits and her aura of untouchable wealth. She refused to look at me, her gaze fixed on the judge. The jury, a panel of ordinary men and women, watched us both with unreadable expressions. My heart pounded against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Uncle Robert sat in the front row, his presence a solid, reassuring weight. Sarah was there too, a few rows back, her calm smile a beacon. Anya's opening statement was a masterpiece of controlled fury. She laid out the narrative clearly, concisely, painting a picture not of a family dispute, but of a calculated, predatory campaign of abuse. She spoke of Margaret's obsession with control, her jealousy, and her willingness to endanger her own grandchild to get what she wanted. "This is a case about betrayal," she concluded, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "The deepest betrayal imaginable. A mother-in-law who saw her son's wife not as family, but as an obstacle. A grandmother who saw her newborn grandson not as a blessing, but as a prize to be seized." When it was my turn to testify, I felt a wave of nausea. Every eye in the room was on me as I walked to the witness stand. I took a deep breath, focusing on a grounding technique my therapist had taught me. Feel your feet on the floor, the solid wood of the chair beneath you. I was here. I was real. I was safe. I swore the oath, my voice shaking only slightly. Anya began her questioning, her voice gentle, guiding me through the story from the beginning. I talked about meeting David, about our life together, about my recovery. I talked about the months after his death, the crushing grief, and Margaret's increasingly suffocating concern. Then we came to the hospital. As I recounted the events of that day, my voice grew stronger. I described Margaret's arrival, her cold pronouncement about the air, the arrival of the lawyer and the social worker. And then I recounted her confession. I repeated her words, the ones my uncle had recorded, the ones that were seared into my memory. "She told me I was a junkie," I said, my voice clear and steady. "She said she had been planning it for months. She said she would not let a Prescott legacy be managed by someone like me." A murmur went through the courtroom. I could feel the jury listening, leaning in. The hardest part was talking about the vitamins. Anya showed the lab reports on a large screen, the cold, scientific data confirming the presence of the sedatives. She held up the bottle, now sealed in an evidence bag. "Mr. Prescott bought you these vitamins, didn't he?" she asked. "Yes," I said, my throat tight. "He was always so careful about my health, about the babies. He would remind me to take them every morning." The cruelty of it was breathtaking that Margaret had twisted an act of David's love and care into a weapon to harm us. The cross-examination was as brutal as Anya had predicted. Margaret's lead attorney, a man named Sterling, was a shark in a $1,000 suit. He came at me from every angle, his questions designed to provoke, to confuse, to discredit. He brought up my addiction, reading from old medical records, painting me as a liar and a manipulator. "Isn't it true, Miss Evans, that addicts are prone to paranoia? To fabricating stories to garner sympathy or shift blame?" He sneered. "I am not an addict," I replied, my voice level. I looked directly at the jury. "I am a person in long-term recovery. There is a difference. One is a state of active disease. The other is a state of daily maintenance and healing. I have been healing for over 5 years." He tried to pick apart my memory of the hospital. "You had just given birth. You were on pain medication. Isn't it possible you misunderstood what was said? That you were hallucinating? The hospital records, which you have, confirm I was on a non-narcotic medication at my own request," I said calmly. I was exhausted, but I was not impaired. And my uncle heard the exact same thing I did. He hammered me for hours. He twisted my grief over David's death into instability. He suggested I was suffering from postpartum psychosis. He even floated the theory that I had drugged myself to frame Margaret out of resentment for her wealth. With every question, I held onto the image of Leo's face. I was fighting for him. I would not let this man break me. I answered every question, no matter how vile, with the simple, unshakable truth. By the end, Sterling looked frustrated. I had not given him the emotional, hysterical outburst he had been hoping for. I had given him quiet, resilient strength. The trial went on for 2 weeks. The prosecution built its case brick by brick. My uncle testified, and the recording of Margaret's confession was played for the jury. Hearing her voice echo through the courtroom, so full of arrogance and malice, was a stunning moment. The social worker, Janice, testified that she had been misled by Margaret, that she had been presented with a false narrative of a mother in active relapse. The toxicologist explained in painstaking detail how the vitamins had been tampered with. He called it a sophisticated and deliberate act. The defense's case was weak. They tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that someone else could have tampered with the vitamins. They put Margaret on the stand, and she presented herself as a grieving mother, terrified for her grandchild's safety. She denied everything, weeping as she claimed I had twisted her words, her concern. But under the prosecutor's cross-examination, her story began to unravel. He caught her in a series of small lies, inconsistencies in her timeline. Her composure cracked. The jury saw the flicker of the cold, calculating woman I knew her to be. The most dramatic moment came when the prosecution presented the evidence from David's exhumation. They brought in a forensic cardiologist as an expert witness. He explained how the combination of the specific sedative and the cardiac drug found in David's system could, in theory, trigger a fatal arrhythmia in a susceptible individual. He could not say with 100% certainty that this was the cause of death, but he stated that it was a highly plausible and medically sound explanation for an otherwise inexplicable cardiac event. When he said that, I saw a tremor go through Margaret's hands. It was the first time she looked truly afraid. The closing arguments were powerful. The prosecutor methodically walked the jury through the mountain of evidence, the pattern of manipulation, the scientific proof of the drugging, and the deeply suspicious circumstances of David's death. "This is not a grieving grandmother," he said, pointing at Margaret. "This is a predator who cloaked herself in the guise of family. She tormented, she drugged, and she may have killed, all for one thing: control." Sterling, in his closing, tried one last time to paint me as the villain. He spoke of my troubled past and my unstable present. He portrayed Margaret as the victim of a vindictive daughter-in-law. But his words rang hollow. The evidence was too strong. The jury was out for 2 days. It was the longest 48 hours of my life. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I just held Leo, rocking him, whispering to him about his father. I told him how much David had loved him, how excited he had been to be a dad. I promised him I would keep him safe, no matter what. The call came on the 3rd morning. The jury had reached a verdict. We all assembled back in the courtroom. The air was thick with tension. I held my uncle's hand, my knuckles white. The jury foreman, a middle-aged woman with a serious face, stood up. She cleared her throat and began to read. "On the charge of assault, we the jury find the defendant guilty." A gasp went through the room. I felt a wave of relief so intense my knees went weak. "On the charge of reckless endangerment of a child, guilty. On the charge of administering a noxious substance, guilty. On the charge of perjury, guilty." With each guilty verdict, another layer of weight lifted from my shoulders. Then came the final charge. "On the charge of manslaughter, we the jury find the defendant not guilty. Not guilty." The words hung in the air. It was a blow, a sharp, painful sting. They hadn't been convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that she had killed her own son. The justice for David was incomplete. I looked at Margaret. She showed no relief, no emotion at all. Her face was a blank mask. She had gotten away with it. She had gotten away with what I knew in my heart she had done to my husband. But then the judge began to speak about sentencing for the charges she was convicted of. He spoke of the calculated cruelty, the violation of trust, the profound and lasting harm she had inflicted on me and her grandchild. He sentenced her to the maximum allowed by law: 15 years in state prison. 15 years. It wasn't life. It wasn't justice for David, but it was something. It was a victory. She would be an old woman when she got out. Leo would be a teenager. She would not be a part of his life. He would be safe. That was the victory that mattered most. As they led her away in handcuffs, her mask finally broke. She looked at me. Just for a second. and her eyes were filled with a venomous, bottomless hatred. Then she was gone. The aftermath of the trial was not an ending, but a new, quieter beginning. The custody case was a formality. The judge granted me sole permanent custody of Leo and terminated all of Margaret's parental rights. He also placed David's entire estate, which was meant for Leo, into a trust that I would manage until Leo came of age. I was finally free of her, legally and financially. But the emotional fallout was a different story. I spent a long time in therapy, processing the trauma of the betrayal, the trial, and the bittersweet verdict. I had to learn to live with the incomplete justice for David. My therapist helped me understand that the legal system could only do so much. It could punish crimes, but it couldn't heal wounds. Healing was my job now. I had to find a way to accept that the full truth of David's death might never be proven in a court of law, but that I knew the truth, and I could honor his memory by living a good life, by raising our son to be a kind and loving man, the opposite of the woman who had raised him. Rebuilding our life was a practical, day-by-day process. I sold the house David and I had shared, the one filled with too many ghosts and painful memories. I bought a small, sunny house in a quiet neighborhood closer to my uncle. I found a part-time job working from home, something that allowed me to be there for Leo. I continued going to my meetings, sharing my story, finding strength in the community of fellow survivors. My sobriety, once the weapon Margaret had tried to use against me, became my greatest source of strength, a daily practice of honesty and resilience. The hardest, and most necessary, step was establishing permanent boundaries. David's family, the ones who had sided with Margaret, tried to reach out after the verdict. There were apologetic letters, tearful voicemails. They spoke of wanting to know their nephew, of wanting to reconnect. I understood their regret, but I could not forget their choice. They had chosen to believe her lies when it mattered most. They had abandoned me and my newborn son. For Leo's safety, and for my own sanity, I could not let that kind of weakness back into our lives. Anya drafted a letter on my behalf, a polite but firm refusal of any contact. It was a final, clean severance. My family now was small me, Leo, Uncle Robert, and my chosen family of friends like Sarah. It was more than enough. Years passed. Leo grew from a baby into a bright, funny, curious little boy with his father's warm blue eyes and infectious laugh. He knew about his father, of course. I filled our home with pictures of David, telling Leo stories about his dad's kindness, his humor, his love for us. He knew about Margaret too, in the simple, age-appropriate terms a child could understand. He knew he had a grandmother who was sick and couldn't be in our lives because she had made dangerous choices. The full, ugly truth could wait until he was much older. For now, his world was safe and happy and full of love. Sometimes, in a quiet moment after Leo is asleep, I sit on the porch of our little house, looking up at the stars. I think about the life David and I planned, and the life I have now. The scars are still there. Faint white lines on my soul. They always will be. The trauma of the betrayal, the fight for my son, the knowledge that David's death was never fully avenged, these things are a part of my story. But they are not the whole story. They are not the ending. They are the foundation upon which I built this new life. A life of resilience, of peace, of fierce protective love. The closing image of my story isn't a courtroom or a hospital bed. It's this: the quiet hum of the cicadas, the gentle breeze, and the knowledge that inside, my son is sleeping soundly, safe, and loved. I survived. We survived. And in the end, that is a justice all its own.